The spring of 1961 in Moscow smelled of melting snow, cheap gasoline, and damp plaster. This scent permeated the heavy coats of passers-by, settled on collars, and settled deep into lungs along with the dust of torn-up construction sites. At 7:45 in the morning, on the platform of the Komsomolskaya metro station, stood a man whose face was impossible to remember for longer than 10 seconds. He was the embodiment of Soviet mediocrity. A gray gabardine trench coat, a worn briefcase with a cracked handle, and the slight slouch of a man accustomed to carrying the weight of endless bureaucratic reports. Did he know at that very second that his life was already over? Did he know that the mechanism of his destruction was triggered not by a political decision or a courier's betrayal, but by the physical law of friction and the reflection of light? He felt invincible because his legend was built on a foundation of absolute truth. His name was Gennady. He worked as an assistant accountant, and he sincerely hated the long lines for sausage. But beneath this layer of grayness hid Asset 312, the finest graduate of the CIA farm, a man whose brain had become a living filing cabinet of ciphers and safe houses. He stood on the granite floor of the station, and his only crime was a passion for order that he could not purge from his synapses. To understand the tragedy of this failure, one must realize the sheer scale of the preparation. Asset 312 had spent 18 months in a classified training camp in Virginia, where every square meter was recreated according to the blueprints of Moscow communal apartments. He was taught to sleep on a rigid wire bed frame, to smoke unfiltered cigarettes that left a specific scent of cheap tobacco, and even to cough as if his lungs were scorched by the harsh climate of the Urals. Instructors hammered the psychology of scarcity into him. He had to grab a newspaper as if it were the last source of information and hide bread in a napkin without even realizing he was doing it. He was a perfect product of the Cold War. His Russian was flawless, with a slight provincial lilt that explained his recent move to the capital. His documents were a masterpiece of the technical department, the correct grade of paper, inks that aged exactly 3 years in a single hour of thermal processing, and even microscopic staple marks exactly where they should be. It was a chess match where every move was calculated decades in advance. But in this complex mathematics of espionage, there was one variable that could not be simulated in Virginia. It was the Moscow mud. The Moscow mud of April 1961 was not merely a natural phenomenon. It was an aggressive substance, a mixture of black soil, sand, coal soot, and salt that covered the sidewalks in a thick layer, turning the city into a gray slush. Every resident of the capital bore this mark. The shoes of a Muscovite at that time were a chronicle of their suffering. Crusts of dried clay baked onto the toes, heels worn down by uneven asphalt, and seams that always held white streaks of salt. The average clerk cleaned his shoes once a day, in the morning, using a stiff brush and a polish that resembled axle grease more than wax. By noon, this procedure lost all meaning, and the city swallowed the shine, turning everyone into a homogeneous mass. However, Asset 312 could not reconcile with this chaos. In his subconscious, raised on the manicured lawns of the suburbs and the clean offices of Langley, dirt was a synonym for sloppiness, and sloppiness led to a loss of control. Every morning, ducking into public restrooms or hiding in dark alleyways between meetings, he would pull a small scrap of suede and a tiny tin of English cream from a hidden pocket in his briefcase. This ritual took no more than 40 seconds. A few sharp movements and the mirror shine returned to the tips of his shoes. He did this instinctively, like a professional assassin checking a safety catch. He believed that a flawless appearance emphasized his discipline and made him invisible among those who had given up. But it was precisely this shine that became his death warrant. The hunt began in a quiet office on the 4th floor of the Lubyanka building. There, amidst the blue smoke of Herzegovina floor cigarettes, sat a man whose job was to find anomalies. The major of the KGB 7th Directorate was not looking for spies in trench coats with upturned collars. He was looking for inconsistencies in the rhythm of the city. On the major's desk lay the surveillance reports. The logs for the week resembled a dull grocery list until his eyes caught a single detail. A surveillance team, working on an entirely different target, had accidentally captured a man in the crowd twice on a hidden Leica camera. The first time was at the exit of a bakery on Gorky Street. The second time, 3 hours later, at the entrance of the Lenin Library. During that interval, the city had endured 2 brief rainstorms that turned the streets into rivers of gray sludge. All the passers-by in the photographs looked like shadows rolled in ash. Their footwear blended with the color of wet concrete. But this man, Gennady, shone. In the black and white photograph, his shoes looked like 2 black holes absorbing the light. They were unnaturally, provocatively clean. For a professional from the 7th Directorate, this was a signal louder than a gunshot. Why did a minor clerk, amidst a transport collapse and melting snow, look as if he had just stepped off a private jet in Zurich? The phase of deep penetration began. Asset 312 was placed under 24-hour surveillance. 4 vehicles rotated every 2 hours. Plainclothes operatives handed off the tail in the metro, in shops, and in parks. They did not get close. They listened to the city. In the analyst's headphones, magnetic tape hissed, recording every step Gennady took. The sound of his gait was too confident. He did not shuffle his feet like a man accustomed to conserving energy. His shoes made a characteristic dry creak of expensive leather that was impossible to mistake for the crackle of Soviet imitation hides. Every minute the Secret Services asked themselves, where does he get this polish? Laboratory analysis of the dust collected from his tracks in a stairwell revealed synthetic waxes and specific oils that were not produced in a single factory in the socialist camp. This was a Western trail, smelling of lavender and beeswax, hidden beneath the mask of Soviet daily life. Asset 312 continued his work, unaware that an invisible ring was tightening around him. He passed microfilms in dead drops disguised as ordinary stones in Sokolniki Park. He conducted radio sessions, hiding the antenna in the frame of an old window. He was perfect in everything, except for his feet. On a Tuesday, when the Moscow sky was overcast with heavy leaden clouds and a long, cold rain began, he made his final mistake. Crossing the street near the Park Kulturi metro station, he accidentally stepped into a deep puddle hidden by a layer of fresh debris. His right foot sank into the slush up to the ankle. Any normal Muscovite would have simply cursed and moved on, knowing they would dry off on the tram. But Asset 312 froze. A look of almost superstitious horror reflected in his eyes. He looked around quickly, ducked into the nearest apartment entrance, and, seeing the stairs were empty, whipped out his cherished cloth. He cleaned the shoe for 3 minutes with the intensity of an obsessive, trying to return the boot to its original, non-Soviet state. Meanwhile, in a van marked Bread, parked across the street, a thermal imager operator and a photographer with a telephoto lens recorded his every gesture. It was a documented confession of a love for another culture, another standard of cleanliness. The trap snapped shut that same evening. He was returning home, feeling the pleasant fatigue of a job well done. In his pocket lay a reply from the center, encoded in the cover of a cheap detective novel. At the last turn to his house, where the streetlights had long since burned out, 3 men blocked his path. They did not look like muggers. They wore the same gray coats as he did, but their shoes were honestly, truly filthy. One of them, a short man with cold eyes, looked down at the agent's feet. In the light of a distant car's headlight, the tips of Asset 312's shoes flashed one last time. The major of the 7th Directorate spoke quietly, saying that in our country, such cleanliness is considered an insult to society. It was the logic of absolute paranoia, against which any intelligence school is powerless. As he was led through the corridors of the internal prison, he heard only the echo of his own steps. Now his shoes were stained with the blood and dust of the interrogation room, and he had finally become indistinguishable from millions of others. But it no longer mattered. In the Cold War, the winners were not those who shot better or knew more secrets. The winners were those who knew how to dissolve into mediocrity, who allowed themselves to be sloppy, lazy, and imperfect. Those who accepted the mud as part of their skin. His failure became a classic example in counterintelligence textbooks. It proved that the deepest disguise is shattered not at the level of ideology, but at the level of domestic habits ingrained in us at the age of 5. Cleanliness, which was a virtue in one world, became evidence in another. Now, decades later, analysts study this case as a reminder. A spy is ruined not by a lack of talent, but by an excess of upbringing. In a world where everyone wears gray masks, a mirror shine on one's boots is equivalent to a switched-on spotlight in a moonless night. When the video ends and the screen goes dark, only this image remains: a black shoe shining in a puddle of filthy water. It is a symbol that human nature is always stronger than any legend. We cannot stop being who we are, even when our lives depend on it. Espionage is not a game of cat and mouse. It is a slow self-destruction where every detail, from the way you hold a cigarette to your reluctance to soil your shoes, is a crack in the armor. And through this crack, the cold logic of the enemy will eventually reach the very heart. Remember this the next time you decide to bring something to perfection in a world that values only grayness. Your pursuit of the ideal might just be your final mistake.